a wonderful honor for me to introduce also a distinguished member of my guild, the Directors Guild of America, Mr. Richard Brake. Thank you. There's some water here for you, too.
Yeah, I have water. Hi. Are we going to look at a clip first?
Whatever you'd like.
I would dispense with the clip. Who cares? I mean, do you want to see a clip of Woody Allen? No. No. Woody Allen, unfortunately, has... Let's dispense with the clip. He's no longer commercially viable. I was privileged. I worked with him for 3 pictures in the late 90s. And since then, he can't be financed in the U.S. His films lose money for the last 10 years. Everybody who gets involved financing him has been hammered with financial losses. So for the last 4 films, he's working abroad in Europe. But in any case, that's Woody Allen. I wanted to say something briefly about how I got into the business, because you presumably are all interested in this crazy business. And I, you know, a lot of it is luck and timing and placement, and it's a given that you are serious, and it's a given that you are really on the ball and focused, so that if an opportunity presents itself, you grab it. And I went to film school at Columbia, a graduate film program, Master of Fine Arts degree, when I was 25, which is pretty late. I'd been doing other things. And there was a teacher there who got, you know, money to make a feature-length documentary that was financed by Harry Belafonte, who always was in the forefront of liberal causes. And this film in 1970, which is a long time ago, was a feature-length documentary about 3 American families who lost children in children who were killed in political deaths in the year 1970. And so the film had tremendous scope. It was a white Jewish young woman at Kent State, a black student at Jackson State College 10 days later in May, and an Italian-American young man who was walking point in Vietnam and stepped on a mine. And we spent a tremendous amount of time with those 3 families, and it was a very powerful film called Part of the Family. And it was broadcast on public television in the US, and it, I think, was considered an indictment of this country, a deserved indictment at the time, so that it played theatrically in theaters in France and in England. And it's a special film. So when the professor announced to his class that he had this money, was going to make this film, I campaigned to be hired to be the production manager on the film, and told him I was the best of all the students and I'd work for the least amount of money, which is what a filmmaker wants to hear, because then he'll get a bargain in somebody, and then maybe he'll be able to shoot 2 more days because he's exploiting that person. And yet it was the best job I ever got. It was my first job, and it was a feature project. It was a big project. And as the production manager, I was responsible for the equipment and the logistics of moving us around all over the country, paying people, and a lot of the technical issues that you have in any film. This was a 16mm color film in those days. So dealing with the laboratory and post-production titles and everything else, permissions. And it was excellent training. And I pretty much started at that point a production managing career, which grew into a producing career, which is one step up from production managing. At the same time, being, New Yorker and somewhat savvy, I would like to think, I always thought that if you went to film school and you paid a lot of money, you should leave with some employable skills. Because it doesn't, the idea that you're going to be a writer-director is nice, that's a goal, but it's not practical. Nobody cares that you want to be a writer-director. So I learned how to be a sound recordist in film school. Camera work struck me as too competitive, and the equipment was too expensive. I wasn't ever going to be able to buy a camera. But the Nagra tape recorder, which was the reel-to-reel standard Swiss-made tape recorder in those days.
You still have one here, Richard.
Well, they're wonderful. I miss mine, and I'm looking to buy a used one because I have boxes of reel-to-reel tapes that I can't listen to. But the Nagra and some mics and the right technique, I learned how to be a sound recordist, and I did through the 1970s. For 10 years, I recorded sound on documentaries, on commercials, and on news shows for the BBC and a variety of places. And I did that in parallel with the production managing. And in 1980, I sold all my sound equipment, and I specialized in production work, and I never did sound again. Now, so in 80, I was a full-time production person, and the question, since you've seen Hanging with the Homeboys, that was an interesting project, and I'll tell you something of how I got the job, because we're talking, or I'm speaking, from the point of view of a freelance person in this business. And I like calling it a crazy business because it's a strange business. It's not like being a dental hygienist or going to an office and having a very straight job. Freelance work, you're unemployed after every job. It's not for everybody. It's uncertain. But I've done that for, since 1971 when I got out of film school. The good part about it for me as a producer, production manager, is each of my jobs tends to last a year. So it's not like a 3-day job, and then what do you do? When I get hired, I'm hired at the very, very beginning of a project, sometimes before the project has even been approved for production, the so-called green light of financing. And I may be brought in to do budgets and schedules and preparatory work to help the producer sell the project to financiers so they'll put up the money so we can proceed. So I may come in for 2 weeks or 2 months doing this kind of work, and then if it gets greenlit, I have the job, and then I work for 8-10 months. So on Hanging with the Homeboys, which was made by New Line Cinema, they were very interested in, I think, as any company is, it's a profit-making business, or they hope it's a profit-making business. The Hudlins had just done House Party, and it had hit big home run, made a lot of money. So the idea was, this is a proven model. There is this target audience that will come out and see a good film. And so, to some extent, the white management of New Line, and I don't fault them, but it's the same sort of blindness in the pursuit of profit that is the basis for a lot of decisions at a lot of companies in this business. Like, somebody makes the Blair Witch Project, which I didn't think much of. I thought it was sort of a piece of garbage. But but it made huge amounts of money, and then everybody says, that's it, we should make one of those. And so a lot of companies will push things like the successful model into production, and they all fail. So Homeboys was brought to New Line, and a development vice president named Janet Grillo knew the writer-director, Joe Vasquez, who Jeffrey went to school with. And he had made 3 extremely low-budget personal feature films that didn't get seen, but they showed passion, point of view, and they were accomplishments for the tiny amount of money that was spent on them. You know, they were interesting films. And she read his script and said, I'm going to champion this. And it was going to be made for $2 million, which was, for Joe Vasquez, like going to the moon. I mean, it was a huge amount of money. And they needed a producer. So I got called in to meet him, because to their credit, they weren't going to hire anybody to be his producer who he couldn't work with. He had, you know, I met him, he was a young guy, and he had approval of me. And at this lunch, we go out for a sandwich with the New Line person. I really stuck my neck out, and I asked how much he was going to get paid on this film. And he had a deal, I believe it was $200,000 for writing, directing, and starring in the movie. And they were offering me $100,000 to be the producer for this one-year cycle. And the first thing I suggested were 2 politically bad things to suggest to a guy who can approve you or not. I said, you shouldn't be in your own movie. It's a terrible mistake. And he thought that was outrageous. This was his idea. This is his story. It's about a guy like him. He's going to be in the movie. And I said, no, you can't be in your movie. You know, it is extremely hard to direct a film of this scale, and to do your best work, you have to be behind the camera. You can't be part of the on-camera process as well. It'll compromise it. It won't work. It's a stupid idea. Don't do it. And he you know, thanked me for my stupid idea, and he said, do you have any other ideas that are stupid? And I said, yeah, I think you're being overpaid. And that was like not, you know, I said, I think you should, because you're not going to be writer, director, producer, writer, director, actor, I'm taking away one of your functions, we should lower your salary by 1/3. And I will take less money, you know, happily. I will work for, so I proposed lowering my salary to $75, his salary to $150. $75 for each of the 2 surviving roles, writer and director. And he looks at me like I'm crazy, you know. And I said, I'm telling you, this is a smart move, because you will, you know, by putting money back in the budget, we will make a better film. And that was what my pitch was to get this job. And I afterwards realized I'd probably never hear from them, but I got the job, and we made the film. And by putting, you know, I don't know that he actually took the cut in salary because they had made a deal with him, but that was okay with me. I worked for the lesser fee. He got whatever he got, but he wasn't distracted by being the actor. And I think he made a pretty good film. So a producer's role, illustrated by that story, is a complicated role. There are many types of producers, and I'll just summarize a few of them. And then I'll say a few things about the line producer role, which is pretty much the function I've filled most of the time. But what we've, you know, if you look back, and to be successful, I think, in any business, you have to know the history of that business and how it was done in the past to better understand why we do it the way we do it now. And if there's one book to read, it's called The Genius of the System by a guy named Tom Schatz, S-C-H-A-T-Z, who is at University of Texas at Austin. And he has variously run the graduate film program there. And the genius of the system is the history of producing within the American studio system. And it traces the heyday of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and it ends in the early 1950s. And it is a fascinating book. It's out of print. My wife published it. It's, you know, you'd have to find it used somewhere, but it is very important, particularly for anybody who might want to be a producer, because that's the history of this job. And in those days, the studio days, there was one producer on a movie. It's very simple. And there'd be one head of production at a studio. And somebody would have an idea, let's make this gangster film or this musical. And the head of the studio would say, yes, boom. And that was it. And there was no discussion, and there was no bullshit, and that picture went into production. It was a highly efficient industrial process. It has never been that efficient or good, as far as I'm concerned. Today, we're in a totally different world. And decisions of what movies to green light, what movies to make, are tortured, complicated processes. People like directors who have 2 Academy Awards, whose films have made $60 million, have trouble getting their pictures financed. There is no slam dunk, with the exception of tiny pockets, like the guy who made Borat pre-sold the next one on a verbal pitch. I think it's about his character, who's Bruno, the homosexual fashionista guy. That's, I think, the next one we're going to get. And, you know, that deal was made like that because Borat made so much money. But that's 1 to 2% of, I think, representative of all the projects that, in general, we have 500 movies made a year, theatrical features in this country, and most of them, you know, 480 of them, say, go through a tortured process. And the process to approve production today is tortured because the studios are all owned by larger corporations that are in other businesses. For them, this isn't some passion thing making movies. It's a unit of a large machine, commercial machine, and it has to make money, and they don't want to hear about all the stuff that goes with it. So the decision processes are completely different, and they're made by committees. And at those committee meetings, where a decision of should we make this picture or not, sitting at the table are marketing executives and other people who have to predict how much money this project would make if we go ahead with it. And if they're wrong, they're fired. So they are very conservative in their voting. And you have today a risk-adverse system where nobody wants to take a risk. And so we have a total increase of sequels and prequels and franchises, and people are looking to hook, hopefully, the success of Project A onto an existing proven form, be it the Blair Witch Project or Borat. And there's no interest anymore in, you know, and I'm talking about the studio system. The independent world, which is, we are in the capital, I think, New York, of the independent world, which is very different than the studio system. Okay. Where, particularly with digital technology, anybody with an idea and a script who can put together $85,000, it seems, can make a feature film. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad. Most of those films are like stillborn babies. They go nowhere, and they probably shouldn't be made. But that's another discussion. But there is a different world, and we happen to be in the middle of it in New York. Now, producers. Since, you know, if you go to a very famous old family-owned laboratory, DuArt Film and Video, if you're ever on 55th Street, 245 West 55th Street, and you stick your head in the lobby, there are some old posters up right in the lobby. And those old posters are from the heyday of the studio system. And they tend to be 1940s feature films. And if you look on the posters, the credit block where they list who the key people were, they are remarkably, I mean, they didn't even have a credit block. It is the writer, sometimes, a lot of times it wasn't even mentioned, the director, the producer, and the star, and that's it. And that has evolved into today, when my favorite thing when I'm waiting on a movie line, and you're bored, and I don't have an iPod, so I look at movie posters, and I count the number of producers on posters. And 6, 8, 10, 12 different producers is common today. And my record is a film that you'll probably never see called Edmund, which was from a play by David Mamet. He wrote the screenplay. It got made. It had 22 producers. And you think, what's going on here? You know, who are these people? What did they do? The truth is that the explosion of unearned producing credits that are, you know, half the poster. And who's on the poster, by the way, is not the whole story. On Edmund, there were 5 more producers credited on the movie in the head credits who didn't have the clout to get named onto the poster. So, you know, because being on the poster is better, because then people see your name and you have visibility, and people say, oh, you did that. You know, I saw it in the movie line, you know, and that's good. So how did we get to this point, which I think is bad? We got to this point because it is, again, so hard to get a picture greenlit today that anybody who can claim to have advanced the process and move that picture closer to a green light has the clout to demand in negotiations that they get a producer credit because it's considered prestigious. So we see today people who are credited producers on movies who are the agents for the star, the managers for the star, the lawyers for the stars themselves. We see people who brought in a piece of the financing. We see all manner of people who have nothing whatsoever to do with the process of making the movie at all. I mean, I've worked on movies that had 7 producers who I never met. And I'm there in my role as line producer every day. I'm there when the trucks arrive and the tailgates come down. I'm there to drink the first cup of coffee and make sure it's good for the crew. I'm there when people leave at the end of the day. I'm there in the editing room. I'm there at casting sessions. I'm there in all the various aspects through the year. I'm hands-on and I'm there. And and I'm certainly there every day of shooting, of course. And I've never met sometimes half a dozen of the other producers who were name-only producers due to some sort of contribution, perceived contribution, to get that green light, which is recognized by producing credit. Now, the studios like this and have contributed to this development, this trend, because, you know, we've all played Monopoly, I assume, but producing credits are considered of value, and therefore they're like money. So maybe, you know, I'm going to hire some actor and I can't afford what they get. You know, maybe they get $1 million to be in a movie. Well, if I'm trying to make a film for a certain price, and every producer's trying to make a film for less money than is easily available, we're always, you know, reaching for more money and how to get the money. So I may say to the actor, you can be a producer. I'll make you an executive producer if you take $100,000 instead of $1 million. And they say, forget about it. You know, I've had that 3 times, you know, and people are still trying to, you know, negotiate me down. It's not worth it. So then maybe I have to sweeten the deal by giving them some gross points in the movie where they'll have ownership, and if the picture makes money, they'll make money. So we're always trying to trade sometimes credits, and often producing credits, or profit participation to lower people's salaries so that we can get a green light, because the package we're trying to pitch and sell, you know, may have a train wreck, and it may have 3 well-known stars, and it may be very attractive, and we can make this $20 million movie for 5. That's very attractive to a studio, because if the lower the budget, the more likely and the sooner it will get into profit if it's successful. So there's a lot of trading of producer credits for these no-show roles. These people do nothing in producing terms. So, you know, I just wanted you to know that. Now, when you look at the poster with 20 names, producing credits, there's no telling, unless you worked on that film or know somebody who worked on that film, there's no telling who did what. There are the following types of producing credits. There are executive producers, there are producers, there are co-producers, there are associate producers. Those are the main film producing credits. In television, it's a different game, and there are even more producers. We see on Law & Order, you know, there are a zillion producers. But the most valuable credit is the producer credit, and it's perceived to be the most valuable credit because when the Academy Awards happen, the Best Picture Academy Award goes to the producer, not to anybody else. So people who want to be producers want that credit, and that's fought over. Usually the person or one of the people who gets that credit are people who have initiated the project, had the idea originally, whether it was a newspaper article or a story or a bunch of letters or whatever the basis for the film is, and they've dragged that idea through a screenplay, through packaging, attracting various people to work on it, actors and the director and a producer, and then they've gotten the financing. The person who does that typically is in the strongest position and takes for themselves the producing credit, and I have no quarrel with that. Sometimes they have to add other people who, again, contributed in some way to get the film financed. Brad Pitt is now a viable producer. We see his name on everything because he is a company that has access to big money, and pictures that Brad Pitt's company believes in tend to get made. So if I have a project and I can't get it financed, if I can get it to Brad Pitt and Brad Pitt's company likes it, it's a given that Brad Pitt will be a producer, and maybe two of his partners will be producer, and yeah, they'll let me stay as producer because I brought it to them. And that's sort of how the process happens. Now, the line producer's job is, I think of it as a job and a function. There's one line producer on a movie, no matter what kind of craziness is going on with the, 3 executive producers and 4 co-producers, and, it doesn't matter. The line producer is the person whose responsibility, I briefly summarized, they hire the crews. If there are unions involved, they negotiate the labor contracts with those unions. They decide what city the picture's to be made in. That's a big one. Because, you might think, well, the script tells you where it has to be. Yes, it does, but it's the writer telling you where it has to be. And when the script is handed to the people who are going to make the film, it's a different sort of analysis. We look at it and we say, well, it calls for New York, but New York is too expensive. So we have to look at other cities. And there's a tremendous amount of that done by the line producer. And when I say done, I mean there's budgeting analysis. In fact, the computerized budgeting programs often give you multiple columns so that you can put down the figures for a particular item in the budget for New York, for Toronto, and for some city in Romania. Because we are seeing now in a global economy a tremendous amount of what is called runaway production, which is, it's like, runaway production is an emotionally charged term. But it's, from the economic point of view, it's totally understandable. People who are going to make movies, people who are going to make television shows for a finite amount of money are going to go to the place where they can get the most for their dollars. It's like picking a store to buy milk, it's very simple. And on a film production level, films are going abroad. American stories are going abroad. In many cases, to Eastern Europe. Romania and Lithuania are dirt cheap compared to the US. South Africa is now a film production center. Australia and New Zealand are also, and our northern neighbor Canada is already in decline because while it's cheaper than shooting in the US, the difference is not what it used to be, and Canada's already too close to the costs of the US. So they are losing. They, who had a tremendous boom in the last 20 years of US projects, US originated projects that would go to Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver, their 3 big centers, they became too expensive, and now they're losing production to these other places. So just be aware that production goes where the money will go furthest, and that's how it is. But the line producer has to decide where it should be made, and then negotiate the deals with the unions as needed. The one union we never can get away from is Screen Actors Guild, because you name an actor, and I will tell you that person's in Screen Actors Guild. And one thing about union membership, like the #1 rule, is once you join a union, you agree not to work non-union. You agree not to work without a union contract. So, if you want Johnny Depp or Meryl Streep or Leguizamo, the only way you're going to employ them in your project is if you sign a Screen Actors Guild contract. So that's one union that we always have. But whether or not the drivers of the trucks are in the union, or the shooting crew is in a union or the editors are in a union. That's all to be figured out, and my personal point of view is, as a producer, is whatever's best for the picture is what you do. And union workers, and I'm very, very pro-union, but union workers on films cost more. They tend to be more experienced, they tend to be more expensive, and the producer's job is to figure out, do we need a union crew on this film? Or could this be made with a non-union film, a non-union crew? If we can shoot, and the difference in savings might translate into 7 extra days of shooting for the director. That guarantees a better film. The biggest problem of, or the biggest challenge, the highest challenge of producing is, how can a project be organized in all of its ways, from the city to the union negotiation to who serves lunch, to what camera you use. Is it video? Is it film? And which format within film or video? All those questions. The whole constellation of decisions in pre-production when you're planning a project really should have one goal. And the goal is, in my view, it's to create the best working conditions for the actors and the director to do their best work, period. It's not about anything else. It's certainly not about, I mean, that's why we're there as producers, is to help the director and the actors do their best work. Fewest distractions, least pressure, slowest pace, so they can do good work, they can do multiple takes, they can be thoughtful and talk if they have to on the set, and somebody's not screaming at them, we got to hurry up, we got to hurry up, we got to hurry up, and it's some important moment. A producer who allows that to be the reality on their set has failed. They've put the creative people in the worst situation. So in that way, I think producing can be highly creative, although it's not often thought of as creative. And one of the things about showing clips is the work of the producer is invisible. You just can't see what was done. I mean, I could show a clip and talk to you for 45 hours about the decision process of what went into each day's shooting, but it should be seamless and invisible, because that's the nature of producing. It's enabling others to do their best work. And to do that, you have to have complete control. You have to pick, when I hire crew people to work on a movie, it's the same, I think of it as the same as casting the actors. Every single person on my set has to want to be there and has to be, like they're in church and they're religious and they believe. They have to be reverent, and if they're not, I don't want them on my set. I don't want to see a cell phone. I don't want to see all sorts of behavior where people are not focused on the process. And I feel really strongly about that. So that makes me like a nut. But if I'm the producer on a movie, I enforce that. And people respond. And I tend to try to assemble groups that really care about what we're doing. So a line producer is that one producer in this group who does all these things. Signs the checks, deals with problems, and there are always problems on films. The credit, I don't want you to, meet me in the streets and grab me and say, you told me about these credits. I've been studying movie posters. I haven't seen the line producer credit. You rarely see that particular credit, because line producers typically try to negotiate for a different screen credit. Their function, their job, what they do every day is what I just described. That's the line producer job. But I'd say in 100 movies, you will see that person receiving a line producer screen credit in only 3 or 4 out of 100. The rest of the time, they can negotiate depending on how experienced they are and how much they're wanted and how skilled they are and how much of a salary cut they'll take to get the job. They sometimes are co-producers in the credits, sometimes they're executive producers, and the really top ones can demand and get a shared producer credit. That happens. So the line producer credit is rare, but the job is clear, and that's what it is. Now, should I continue, or should we go to questions?
We can start question and answer soon, and then we can go back into anything you want to fill the holes with. But I know most of the students had prepared a small question.
Well, let's do questions, so I can try to do a good job with your questions. Who has?
Who would be the first volunteer to ask Richard Brick a question? It can be about anything. First person, please don't put your hand up all the
Yes.
same time. Jonathan, say your name, full name.
Jonathan Jones.
Hi.
What was it like working with Joseph Vasquez? And what was your first reaction?
Well, he and I had totally different backgrounds. But once we got through that lunch, and I suggested that he'd take less money and not be in his own movie, I convinced him that he had to believe that I was going to watch his back and was going to do everything short of killing on his behalf to make sure he got every possible thing he could get to do his best job. And I had to convince him of that. And he believed me. So then we settled into a terrific working relationship, one of the best I've had with other directors. He trusted me, and I worked really hard to get him what he needed. And he was prepared. He was telling a story that came out of his life, and he knew exactly what he wanted. It was a terrific working relationship. We had a major bump or problem, and most films have a problem or bigger problems. He got in a fight in the middle of shooting with a guy who, you guys are young, but anybody here know what a token sucker was? It's amazing.
That's when a guy who,
Back when tokens.
when you got tokens and you'll suck it out.
Yeah, when we all had tokens before Metro cards, you'd put your token in the thing, and it would drop down just a little. And before you walk through the turnstile where it goes into the mechanism, it sits right there at the top. So there were some people who would, they tended to be big, male, imposing people, who would say, sorry, it's broken. Find another turnstile. And you'd size them up, and most of the times you'd go to another turnstile. They put their mouth over the token slot and go and suck the token into their mouth. And they could make $100 an hour tax-free. And then by the time the Transit Authority cops come, they'd go to some other station. And this was a big thing in the late 70s, 80s. I mean, so Homeboys, it was a big thing, 1990. And Joe, in the middle of shooting, was taking the subway and got into a beef with a guy who was trying to suck his token. And he said, give me back my token. And like that, they pulled out knives, and it was a whole thing. And Joe got very badly cut, like this. And we had to shut down production. Hospital 300 stitches. It was a huge, and he got depressed. He thought I acted like an idiot. Shouldn't have done this. I'm in the middle of a movie. It was only a token, but that was who he was, and he didn't back down, but it became a huge problem. And he was like in bed, under the covers, didn't want to see anybody, fuck you, get lost, leave me alone. And that was like the second day, the third day. So as the producer, I went to him and I said, talking to him through the covers, I said, I want you to know I've talked to the president of New Line Cinema, and they put $2 million into this thing. They expect you to finish it. If you don't come to work today, they're going to hire Hudlin to finish your film. And he like jumped out of bed, and we went back to shooting. And that conversation never happened, but whatever was necessary to get him back to work. And we finished the movie, and there was insurance that partly covered the stopping of the shooting. And I got very close to him and thought he was terrific. Later, when I heard he was sick, and it was just a tragedy, and I felt horrible about it. But that's really all I could say. A lot of us have lost people, and he was a working colleague, but it was really too bad. He would have made a lot of fine films. He was a talented man.
Scholarship named after him at City College for some time by New Line Cinema.
New Line did that?
Yeah.
Good for them. I'll say one more thing since you've seen that film. When we were in pre-production on Hanging with the Homeboys, we had, as you know, there are 4 guys in the ensemble cast, and the New Line choice for one of those guys was Chris Rock. And Joe worked with him in a rehearsal, and he said to me, I don't want this guy. I said, really? He's supposed to be a big deal. New Line wants him. He says, I don't care. I don't want him. And he says he doesn't get it. He doesn't understand the script. He can't take direction. He doesn't listen to me. He's a zero. I can't do anything with him. Mario Joyner, all these other guys, Leguizamo, they get it. They're good, but he's the weak link. I don't want him. So I went to New Line, and I said, he doesn't want Chris Rock. And I fully expected New Line to say, he's young, he doesn't know anything, it's our money, and do what a studio always, not always, but almost always does, which is force, particularly lead cast, on a director. And to their credit, this woman named Sarah Risher, I never forget it. She said, if Joe feels strongly, it's his movie, who does he want? And he wanted Doug E. Doug. And so we switched. Now, Chris Rock learned a few things and is now a huge star. But be that as it may, that was very impressive to me. And I was prepared to argue Joe's point of view that we had to, but I just stated the problem, and I never got to make any argument. They said, fine. And so Chris Rock was out, and Doug E. Doug was in. It was very interesting.
We have another question for Richard Brick. Sean, say your full name.
Sean Tiger. What was your day like as commissioner of the New York City's mayor office?
Well, that job was a completely different thing. You're working for the city. There was a staff of 10 or 12 people in a stuffy office. The job of that office, and it's, today, if you go online, there's a film commission in every single state in the United States, and in every big city, and in a lot of counties. There's an association of film commissioners that has like a couple hundred people, and they have a convention and a whole thing. They all try to do what we tried to do, which is attract production, TV, feature, commercials, even still photography. You try to attract production to come to your city because it's considered clean, non-polluting an industry that employs people and has an economic benefit for the city. When people are paid wages, they pay taxes on those wages. When you make a feature, you buy lumber, you buy paint, you rent studios, you rent trucks. You know, a lot of money is circulated in a way that supports and benefits the home base, the city. So it's considered to be, you know, production is considered to be clean and good economic development. The first film commission in the country was in New York. A guy named John Lindsay founded it 40 years ago. And that's an important fact. So when I got the job, it was working for David Dinkins in the last part of his term. And we approached it. The first thing I did was I had to hire a deputy commissioner. And it's politics. And so I was told that I had to hire a certain politician's wife. And I interviewed her, and I thought she was clueless, and I didn't want to hire her. And I said, no. And they said, you don't understand. We're telling you what you got to do. And I said, you don't understand. I'm not going to do it, and if I'm forced to do it, I'll quit. I'll hold a press conference. It'll be a big embarrassment to the administration. And that went away. And I got to hire a guy I worked with in production, a guy from our union, Directors Guild of America, a production manager. So he and I came into that office pretty energized and treated the job like it was a feature film. And we worked 12 hours a day, and the city employees, of course, would come at 9:30 and leave at 5. You know, you couldn't talk to them during lunch. You know, they were on a very different city worker schedule, which had to be respected because that was what their lives were. But we were very fired up and crazy, wanting to take New York at that time. It was 1992. There had just been a bit of New York history. There had just been a boycott that lasted 7 months long, where the studios decided that the New York unions had too good a deal, too sweet a deal. They charged too much money, their wages were too high, their union contract was too strong. It just cost too much money to come to New York to work. And they all got together illegally, the 7 heads of productions of the 7 studios, and they said, we're going to roll back the contract, or we're just going to punish New York. And they offered a new contract. Every 3 years is a new contract for the shooting unions. And the unions freaked. It's like they were going to lose 25 years of things they had collectively bargained for and gotten as benefits. Like, after 8 hours of work, the New York unions got double time. Nowhere else in the country was that the case. In Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, the unions, after 8 hours, would get time and a half. So New York had this privileged thing. Studios say, we're taking that away. Your 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th hours will be paid at time and a half like your brothers and sisters in other unions, in the same union in other cities. So the unions refused to sign the contract. The studios said, until you sign the contract, we're bringing no work to New York. So for 7 months, starting in 1990 until 91, the city was like a desert as far as film production. There was nothing being made here. And motion picture laboratories, hardware stores, vendors, costume houses went out of business. And important films that were scripted for New York, including some film about the Yankees, the history of the Yankees, were shot in Toronto. You know, they had footage of Yankee Stadium they shot from a helicopter, and that was it. They never set foot, literally, in New York. So the studios succeeded in forcing the unions to give up a lot and signed the contract that was more like the rest of the country. And this was in 1990 to 91, 7-month boycott of the city. So things were really dead in New York, and a lot of people were hurting who made good livings in this business. And I came along at that point and got hired. And, you know, so my job was to get the studios to come back here. And so we really, being production people, coming from making movies, understanding what movie making is, we granted some outrageous things to studios, like there was, you know, a big film, studio film with Arnold Schwarzenegger called Last Action Hero. And it's, you know, I don't suggest anybody go out and see it. It was, the only thing cute about it was something about watching movies and being able to step into the screen and get into the movie. But it was a, you know, minor film in terms of concept, but it was a very big film. You know, it's like $70 million. And they wanted to do big stuff. And I said, what do you want? Whatever you want, you got. And they wanted to so when I listened to what they wanted, we closed to traffic. And that includes city buses, taxis, private cars. 42nd Street to 52nd Street between Broadway and 8th Avenue, which includes most of the Broadway theaters. Between 3 o'clock in the afternoon and 3 a.m., there was no traffic. And so they could just, that was their location, and they could do anything they wanted. And, you know, there were, in the beginning, a couple hundred police. But the policy in New York is police, there's no charge for anything the mayor's film office does for productions, because that's part of being production friendly. So we set this up, and the studio couldn't believe it, you know. And the word went out. There's this guy, you tell him what you want, you can pretty much, you know, anything you want. And it sort of, there was a couple of those. There was a film called Cowboy Way, which, again, was not anything special as a film, but it was a big studio film and employed a lot of people. And there was some, you know, writers sit and write scenes, and then that page can become a huge issue to how to execute. And the guy on the horse, there was a cowboy from out west who ends up in New York with this horse. He has to gallop after a subway train, an elevated subway train, on a bridge, and then jump from his horse onto the back of the subway so he can get into the subway and save the girl who's being kidnapped or something, which is an old theme. But this writer puts it on a bridge with a subway, and it's a big deal. So we had to close a bridge, and we had to lay down on the adjacent, because horses can't run on subway tracks. We had to lay down 2 sheets of 3/4-inch plywood. Then it had to be sprayed with some stuff so it wouldn't be slippery, because plywood is slippery. The horses' hooves had to have special shoes. And, I mean, it was really complicated. But the execution of it was like nothing. Getting permission from the MTA to do this took 6 months. It was really hard, because the MTA, as you may or may not know, is not a city agency. You know, it's a authority, and it's between the governor and, you know, and it's independent. So the mayor, certainly not the film commissioner, tells the MTA what to do. Getting permission took 6 months, and then one day we shot this. And it cost them nothing. Traffic was like diverted to some other bridge, you know, and we closed the bridge. And we did stuff like that, which sent out the word that New York City wanted your business if you were a studio. And that's the kind of big stuff we used to do. Then people come into the office and you give them permits. To get a permit to shoot in a public place in New York City, that means a park, a city-owned building, or on a city street, to get a permit, which is free, you have to have insurance because it's in general dangerous business and people get hurt and the public trips on cables and things happen. The city wants it to be well insured, so you have to have an insurance policy. But if you have the insurance, anybody can get a permit to do pretty much any kind of shooting on city-owned property. It's wonderful. And that's what that office does. The official name of that office is the Mayor's Office of Film, Theater, and Broadcasting. And it's an economic development thing. The last thing I'll say about it is production in New York is going like this, which is good. It's at an all-time high, and the reason it's gone up is because New York State and New York City got together and enacted in the legislature an incentive program. So if you bring, you're a studio, you're a producer, you're Dick Wolf, Law & Order, if you make your project in New York City, you get 15 plus advertising 1%. You can get free advertisement on bus shelters and public places. You get 16% back as a rebate of your budget that's spent in New York City. That 16% closes the gap between New York being the most expensive place to shoot, which it is. All of a sudden, it's 16% less expensive. And since it's so terrific and we have so much here, people are like rethinking. And there were 7 television pilots for different television series, which are being made right now. So we may have a whole new crop of New York City-based television next year. It was much cheaper then when I was the chairman. But the real thing is, when I was a student there in 1970 and 71, it was almost affordable. It was so cheap. It has gotten horribly expensive to go to these programs. And I have very mixed feelings about them. People who go through these Master of Fine Arts degree programs leave with huge amount of debt. And they're entering a business where it's hard to get a first job, and it's not really a rational decision. The 2 or 3% of students who are rich and don't have to worry about it, they don't think about it. But for everybody else, it's a huge thing to go into that much debt. And I mean people leaving with $40,000 and $50,000 and $60,000 of debt. I am very troubled by that, and I don't think that necessarily makes sense at all. Look, if one can learn enough to have the technically, to make a really good short, and it can be seen, good things follow. That's just how it is. But the biggest challenge to all filmmakers is having the right idea. Too many people gallop into production with I think, a half-baked idea or a bad idea, and they end up making a film that nobody cares about, nobody sees. I'm talking about the few people who are able to make a film, and when it's seen, people go, they go, hey, get this guy on the phone. I want to meet this person. Who made this film? Where they're willing to invest in that person on their next project. That's what everybody in this business who's starting out seeks to do, is to make that project, whether it's a short, whether it's video, whether it's even a documentary or fiction, that really captures. That's really the goal, because the one thing we can count on in this business is there's a tremendous amount of churning of talent and people, and there's always a hunger for new talent. Everybody is always, there are 500 agents and 2,000 development executives who are looking for the next Steven Spielberg. There's no question. They're looking for that person. So people would leave Columbia's film program with their thesis project, and they'd want it to be a calling card that could be like a medieval catapult and throw them over the wall and get them into the big game on something else. And that's why we started 20 years ago a film festival at Columbia. And I think one of the most instructive and worthwhile things people can do is to get hold of their DVD and for people to look at what kinds of films people are making in a place like that. As a professional, I am amazed when I go every May to this festival of student work, and it's 1 week long. When I began this thing 20 years ago, there weren't that many people making films, even though it was a film school. You know, they were making scenes or shorts, but real films with beginning, middles, and ends, and credits and music. You know, the whole program filled one night, and we even had a panel discussion in the middle of it with professors, because we only had like 4 films. Now it's 7 days worth of stuff. The films are amazing. The films are amazing. I want to like pick up the phone and say, I want to meet this person. You know, I mean, for whatever reason, and it's a complex set of reasons, the students who get into that program, who go into debt, somehow make amazingly compelling movies about things that matter, about, you know, terrorism and suffering and racism and, you know, sexism and capitalism, and, you know, and they make really dramatic films that have surprise turns and twists in the plot and are beautifully handled. I mean, they are, you know, if I were a studio executive, I would say, first thing I would say to one of those people is, do you have a feature script? And of course, these students say, here. And then I'd read it, and I'd give them a small budget I would take a chance on these people. So that's how it works. And it can be a very terrific success story. The big problem is money and the debt. And I don't have to tell you, if this country weren't trying to build an empire abroad and spending $1 trillion, all education would be free, and that's how it should be. But, you know, so we all have to be politically active at the same time to get the country back from this insane path of destruction, because that's where the money's going, and that's why people have debt. And I feel strongly about that. But the films that are made at Columbia are very advanced, very polished, and inspirational, and they're worth seeing.
If you can't go to Columbia and you don't have that kind of money, how would you
Yeah.
make your career path?
Well, you have to develop the skills. You have to know how to record, you know, good sound. One of my pet peeves are films that have bad sound. I want to find the director and wring his or her neck, because there's no reason ever for bad sound. People have to learn that the microphone has to be as close to the actor as possible, which means just on the edge of the frame line of the camera. Whether it's hidden and worn or it's on a fishpole, you have to get crystalline good sound. That's a skill. It can be taught, it can be learned, it can be done. Everybody has to have that. You have to develop the technical skills so that when you have an idea that's worthy to go into production, you will realize that idea technically well. It has to have solid production value. So you have to accumulate the technical skills and and know people who you can talk into working on your project for 3 or 4 days to get them made so they're good. That is something you have to do, and you can do that in 100 places that are cheaper than Columbia University. Jeff mentioned something that I think is the biggest bargain in the country, which is the student membership for the Independent Feature Project, the IFP, is something like $75 a year. And that is an organization. They have a website, ifp.org, that is dedicated. It's sort of the opposite of film school. Doesn't have buildings, doesn't charge tuition, you don't have to go in debt. If you join that organization, they are dedicated to teaching and helping and facilitating young filmmakers do whatever they want to do in their careers. And they have programs, and they publish, things, and they have a website, and they, have speakers. And I once got a phone call from a friend of my wife's who was an art history professor in Boston. And she calls up, and she's a smart lady. She doesn't know anything about film. She doesn't particularly go to a lot of films. And she says, I want to make a feature film. And I said, yes, sure. And she said, no, I found a story in a library in France, an illuminated manuscript, some esoteric story from the 1400s. It's about a greyhound dog that becomes a saint and is prayed to. And I think, yeah, and what happened in this story, this is worth knowing, there's royalty, and they have a castle and the thing, and they got the baby and the nursemaids and a greyhound. And at some point, the nurse or somebody leaves the room, and the prince comes in, and he sees the cradle is on its side, there's blood all over, and the baby's missing. And the dog is like all alert and is like there. And he takes his sword and he kills the dog, right? Because he thinks the dog killed the baby. Turns out that a snake, a poison snake, came in the window and was going up into the cradle to get the baby, and the dog, doing what a good dog should do, fights with and kills the snake and throws him out the window. And then the situation is misunderstood, and the dog is killed. And this really happened. And the dog was buried in almost a church thing, and there's a shrine, and this is a famous story. This woman wants to make this into a feature film. So I told her, I said, join the IFP and do everything, take advantage of every single thing they have, every program, every publication, read every word they put out, and call me in 6 months. And she did. And she showed up, and she was like very sophisticated all of a sudden. And she'd learned a tremendous amount. And she wrote a script. She convinced people to give her $150,000. She made that into a feature film called I don't even know what it's called, The Greyhound Saint or something. And it wasn't the greatest film in the world, but it was pretty interesting. And she couldn't get a distributor, but she distributed it herself. And she made enough money that she calls me up 2 years later, I want you to read my next script, I'm making another film. And she's made 3 feature films as writer, director, and producer. You probably never heard of them. They've never been on TV. But she now is like a working filmmaker at a certain level. And IFP was where she learned what she needed to know to take an idea that was really good and put it together with all the other things she had going for her, which were a lot, because she was an art professor, and she made her films. Now, she didn't go to film school. She joined the IFP. She had to pay $100 because she wasn't a student. But the IFP is the single best idea of learning the things you need to know, which the whole organization is dedicated to answer this question, which is how does one become a filmmaker if one doesn't go to film school? So the IFP is a terrific idea.
And we've had several students work as interns during the IFP market, and they come back with great experience, great stories. I just want to acknowledge a couple of people. Robbie Soman is here. He graduated from our programs, attending Brooklyn College in the Film and Radio TV program. Another great CUNY school. We also have with us Jan Robinson from the Writing Center. I think you've met Dr. Rogo and Brian, so thank you for coming. Round of applause for Richard. Now,